My name is Rachel Fulton, and it is 11 o'clock on Monday, August 14th. I am at Miami University interviewing William Dean for the Cantigny Oral History Project. Mr. Dean, what years exactly were you in the armed forces?
First of all, I have to correct you that it's August 4th, not August 14th.
I'm sorry, it is August 4th.
And
what I had written.
The years I was in the Army is, first of all, I was commissioned when I graduated from Ohio State, and that was on the 2nd of September, 1966. And then I was in the Army exactly 5 years until the 2nd of September in 1971, I believe it was. And I chose the date, so to speak, so that I could remember it. And so the 2nd of September is always an important anniversary for me because it's both the day I went into the Army and graduated from Ohio State and the day I got out of the Army. So it's an easy date to remember.
And of those years, what amount of time were you in the First Division? When was that?
I was in the First Division for only 11 months, and that was from the 1st of April, 1967. And I landed in Vietnam on April 1st, you know, sort of the ultimate April Fool's joke of my life. And then I was with the First Division until after the Tet Offensive in the early part of '68. And I think it was about February of '68 or so that I left the First Division and went to the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, again in the same capacity basically. But I was with the First Division from April of '67 until roughly February of '68.
And what were the exact dates of your time in Vietnam?
Well, as I said, I landed in April 1st, and then I don't exactly remember the date that I left, but it was 18 months after that. And it was sometime about September, I believe, of '68. You know, September, October. I believe it was the latter part of September.
Now, why was it that you decided to go into the service?
Well, this goes back to when I was in college. I was in ROTC. My father had been in the Army, and so that was a strong influence to me. At that time, at Ohio State, you could have an academic alternative to going into one of the service ROTC programs. Ohio State, being a land-grant college, had certain obligations to have students in their ROTC programs. And so it was a choice between an academic alternative or one of the ROTC programs. And my initial choice was the Naval ROTC because I was more interested in small crafts and small boats than I was in being a ground pounder and just walking around. But the Naval program had a different type of scholarship program that you had to apply for. And the paperwork for me was a little bit overwhelming at my age at that time. And also, I'm not quite sure that I met the physical requirements because of my eyesight. So the choice then became between Air Force and Army. Now, where I grew up in Westerville, Ohio, 2 doors down from me was Air Force Colonel, the father of my best friend, who was the head of Air Force ROTC at Otterbein College, which was in the town where I grew up. And so my best friend and his father were always trying to influence me to go into Air Force. And at that time in high school, you know, I had been doing various technologically electrical engineering type things. And so they were encouraging me to go into the Air Force because of my technology background. But at that time, I had never flown. And I was not interested in airplanes very much. And so my father leaned on me to go into the Army because, of course, his Army background. And also at that time, I was interested in forensic science as a career and wanted to become a crime lab director. And so there was also a desire on my part to get some managerial experience. And the Army being a personnel-intensive organization, I thought offered the best opportunities for me to develop whatever leadership and managerial skills that I would need later on in life. So those were all rolled up into my choice as Army. Also, I like the green uniforms better than the blue uniforms, and and we can laugh about this, but it's really true. And I remember one time when I was in high school, being down at the bus station in Columbus, Ohio, where I was taking the bus back and forth between Westerville and Columbus, and there was an Army officer there, and I remember his insignia with the, he must have been an artillery officer because there was a rocket right in the middle of his crossed cannons. And he was wearing this neat forest green uniform, not the normal drab, olive drab sort of uniform that I had expected. So I thought that was pretty neat. So I was always impressed with the uniforms.
Why were you interested in forensic science?
Well, this goes back further into my high school career and junior high school, actually. And at that time, I hung out in the library quite a bit, and I just happened to read about forensic science and the use of science to answer questions of interest to law enforcement. I read about the FBI laboratory, for instance. And so at that time, I was already interested in science. And so I was also interested in applied science as opposed to basic science. And I liked laboratory work and working with my hands and building things. And so I thought that would be an interesting thing to do. And so that's why I directed my life towards a broad-based science education, which is why I studied liberal arts in Ohio State. And because of my interest in electrical engineering, I chose physics. And it came out to be a little bit of a mistake in the sense that I didn't go into electrical engineering because of all the mathematics involved. And little did I realize until I got into physics that physics was nothing more than mathematics with some sort of physical reality attached to it. So at any rate, I did study physics, but again, I was in ROTC, and in fact, that worked out well for me because as I got into the advanced program, you got paid for that. And I didn't come from a very wealthy family. In fact, my father paid for my first year of college, and then I got a job at Sears and Roebuck, or what I called Sears and Rubbish, as a stock clerk. And that paid for my second year of college, and then I was living at home, of course, and commuting back and forth with my father, who worked near the university. And so the third and fourth years of my college were paid by Army ROTC. And then gradually, of course, the GI Bill paid for graduate school and then school after that. So I really, depended on the Army to fund my education. And it was just a great opportunity for me.
Now, you mentioned that your father was eager for you to go into the Army. Did your mother feel the same way?
My mother was pretty neutral about it. I don't recall any influence or opinion stated by my mother. In fact, during the entire time I was in Vietnam, you would expect that she would express some fears about me being there, and there maybe was some of that, but there wasn't a whole lot. And I did try to write her periodically and assure her that things were safe. I had a whole battalion, a whole division around me, and I was certainly more protected than most people. But as far as the influence to go into the Army, that was more from my father than from my mother.
Now, when you went into the ROTC program, then it was 1962, did you have any idea that there might be an open war while you were in the Army?
I believe that in 1962, there was some involvement of the Army in Vietnam. And in fact, a lot of my ROTC professors had come from Vietnam or Korea or whatever. And there was information during that program. It may not have been as early as 1962, but certainly during the time I was in the ROTC program, there was talk about village pacification programs and the role of the Army as part of the military history that we went through. And also during that period, in 1966, which of course is later than what you're talking about, was the period of the reorganization of the Active Army Division, the ROAD concept. And so also during that time, I believe Army Intelligence and Security was changed to Army Security Agency, which was a branch of military intelligence. And so there were a lot of organizational things going on administratively as well as operationally in the Southeast Asia theater. But again, the basic point is that a lot of the instructors in the ROTC program had served in Vietnam. And so, we certainly knew that it would be certainly something that we could serve in. However, as I recall, there were two myths that were promulgated by our professors, and the first one was that reserve officers do not have to pay for buying their dress blues, and the second one was that reserve officers do not serve their first tour of duty in Vietnam, and both of those were false.
These are myths that your professors...
Yeah, somehow I got that idea through the ROTC program.
And you mentioned that some of the professors there had been in Vietnam. Did they ever talk about what they'd been doing in Vietnam?
I don't recall, and it might be that they did, but I don't particularly recall any stories or whatever, other than the one individual who talked to me about what Army Intelligence and Security involves, some electrical engineering aspects.
Did you have an idea of what they had been doing there, though?
Only vaguely, from what we learned in class and what I got from looking at the news and what anybody would see on television and the news magazines. That was my only knowledge of what was going on.
How do you feel about the ROTC program? Do you feel that it worked well, etc.?
I think it worked well. I felt basically that I was well prepared when I went in and took the job in Vietnam. You've got to remember that when I graduated from college, first of all, I didn't know anything about anything, which, I was 22 years old. Basically, I turned 21 while I was at Fort Devens, or Fort Benning. But at any rate, graduated from college, and just a basic knowledge from ROTC. But then I went to Infantry Officer Basic at Fort Benning, Georgia. And so I was trained as a combat platoon leader. The same sort of training that an infantry officer gets who goes into Vietnam and leads a combat platoon. And so I had, small unit leadership, patrolling, company in the attack, company in the defense, platoon in the attack, platoon in the defense, chemical biological warfare, just everything that an infantry officer would learn. And so one of the requirements of ASA at that point was that their officers, their military intelligence officers, would have training in one of the combat arms. There were other officers that went to armor school, for instance. But at any rate, I went through the Fort Benning training, and then I went to Fort Devens, Massachusetts from about January until March of '67. And so I was trained in the equipment, the organization, the mission of the Army Security Agency, and essentially the military intelligence organization and how it's collected, and some information for familiarization and code breaking, although officers don't break codes, but we had some basic instruction in radio direction finding, in radio monitoring, code breaking, and the normal sorts of things, public speaking and maintaining discipline and military justice and, these sorts of basic things. So by the time I got to Vietnam in April, I had had 6 months of training after my 4 years of military ROTC program. And also, as part of the ROTC program, we spent a summer camp at Fort Indiantown Gap Military Reservation for several weeks. And prior to that, Ohio State had a program at a weekend at Fort Knox, Kentucky, which was a very rigorous, intensive, stressful weekend to get us prepared for summer camp, which would get us prepared for the infantry school, etc. So I felt this entire program was very comprehensive, and I thought that it met its needs, and it gave me a basic understanding to do my job when I got to Vietnam. Of course, having said that, you got to remember, when I got out of college, I didn't know nothing about nothing, and never had a job other than my stock clerk job at Sears and Roebuck. And so this was my first real job in life. And it's the first job as part of a very large bureaucratic organization. Not only the Department of Defense and the division, but also the military intelligence organization, which in my case, stretched all the way back to Washington.
So when was it that you found out for sure that you were going to Vietnam?
I was in college, and before I left the ROTC program, I got a letter saying that I was assigned to the 509th Radio Research Group, and and then I was going to report to Fort Benning, Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. So I knew, and probably as I recall, I was just before I started my active duty term, that I was going to Vietnam. And of course the letter, the APO address was San Francisco. And so like everybody, I think I'm going to be assigned to San Francisco, which is great. But then my father says, oh, that means Vietnam, that's the Army Post Office. And so my parents probably realized it before I did. But I accepted that, and that was what was going on at the time. And I felt that from the information I had from the ROTC program and from other people, that being a military intelligence officer at the division level, or even in Army Security Agency level, at whatever level, was a very safe job. One person told me that was like that the Army Security Agency was the country club of the Army, and in a certain aspect that's true, because I always served at a base camp. I always had a PX in the area, an officers club in the area, and a good mess, a food service area. So I didn't have too rough of a time at it compared to other people who were running around out in the field or the jungle or whatever. So I feel that I had a pretty easy time of it while I was in Vietnam.
What exactly does 509 Radio Research, what exactly does that do? What does it mean?
Okay, the organization within country is, of course, hierarchical. And the 509th Radio Research Unit was the group that supported MACV, the Military Assistance Command for Vietnam. And that consisted, I believe, of 2 battalions. The 303rd Battalion, which was at Long Binh, which is the battalion I was at, and it supported the 2 Corps area. And then I Corps was supported up north by another battalion, and then there was also a field station at Phu Bai, which handled strategic intelligence. I was never at I Corps, I was never at Phu Bai. So all of my time was spent within the 303rd Radio Research Battalion. Now, the Radio Research Battalion consisted of various division support companies. So the 337th Radio Research Company supported the First Infantry Division. There was another company that supported the 25th Infantry Division. Another company supported the 101st Airborne Infantry Company. And then there were other units of the 303rd Battalion that supported tactical units within that area. So the 509th was the overall organization within the Army Security Agency. And it was called a Radio Research Unit as a cover name. And in fact, during the time that we were in Vietnam, we wore Signal Corps brass, Signal Corps insignia, not military intelligence insignia. And the reason for that was for security purposes. We were purposely obscuring the fact that the Army Security Agency was in Vietnam. Obviously, when the source of your intelligence is codes and monitoring radio transmissions, you don't want to advertise the fact that you are breaking people's codes and monitoring their transmissions. Otherwise, they shut up, they change their codes, and you lose your source of intelligence. And because of the insurgency nature of Vietnam, and you don't know who knows what, and the people coming in to service your laundry or dig your ditches might be, taking back information to the Vietnam about what happens inside the base camp. We were always very careful about security. And so, in the telephone book, it says RRU, Radio Research Unit, and then people would call us up because they thought it was Refrigerator Repair Unit, and they would want their air conditioning, repaired, and we'd have to say, sorry, we don't do that. So at any rate, there was strong emphasis on security, and it was not well known within the officers that I worked with within the division what exactly I did. And I don't know how much they knew, but I certainly didn't volunteer very much. Basically, I worked with the S2 or G2, the military staff officers for the headquarters, and I passed them information, and I didn't have a lot to do with the other officers of the division or brigade or whatever, other than in support roles. For instance, we had to have a VHF shot for communications to tie our teletypes into a teletype link that goes to battalion, that goes to group, that goes back to Washington, whatever. And so I had to coordinate with the signal officer to keep our teletypes in operation. And we'd put up antennas and they'd get in the way of the helicopters, and so we'd have to be careful about where we put them and that sort of thing. So there was administrative coordination between myself and the rest of the officers in the division, but operationally I supported the S2 or G2. And so the S2 or G2 was the only person that really knew exactly what we were there for.
What are the S2 and G2?
A division or brigade have staff officers. S1 is at a lower level. G is a general level, normally a division level. A brigade or battalion would have an S1. S1 is personnel. S2 is intelligence. S3 is operations. S4 is supply and logistics. S5 was added on later, that was civil affairs. And these are the cabinet level. These are the basic staff officers under the division, brigade, battalion command. So S2 or G2 was the intelligence staff officer, and he was responsible for coordinating intelligence and advising the commanding general or the commanding officer on intelligence matters in regards to operations and the conduct of operations, where the enemy was, where they're likely to be, etc. And under the S2 or G2 were not only myself, but there was military intelligence, IPW, interrogation of prisoners of war, which was human intelligence aspects. There was SLAR, side-looking airborne radar, red haze, that was infrared sensors that would be flown at night. There were visual sightings of whatever from the intelligence officers at a lower level that would feed information in. Contact reports as who got fired on where. So the S2 or G2 would coordinate all this information, take it from on high. Some stuff would come in from 2 Corps. Some stuff would come in from me. I was feeding information from higher levels, like the National Security Agency and the CIA. There were intelligence summaries, communications intelligence summaries, that were provided every morning from other places, from the battalion or Saigon or Washington or whatever, and this would be funneled into the G2 or S2. And I was responsible for maintaining the teletype links so that this communication would continue.
Going back for a minute, during basic training, were you trained with other people who'd been in ROTC?
Well, first of all, don't use the term basic training, because basic training is for an enlisted person. In fact, during the time I was at Fort Knox as part of the weekend preparation for ROTC, I saw what the basic trainees had to go through. And I said, boy, I am sure glad my father made me go into ROTC so I would become an officer rather than an enlisted man, because they had it rough. And so at any rate, I was in ROTC, and in summer camp there were other ROTC officers from all branches. And so that was just generalized training that would be equivalent to basic training. Basic tactical training, again, weapons, we spent a week or so on the firing range with M1s and learned how to fire them and this sort of stuff, marksmanship, as well as just general military training. So all the classroom work that we had in our ROTC program, map reading, military history, the organization and functions, et cetera, as well as the summer camp training, all added up to the equivalent of what would be basic training to an enlisted personnel. So during all that time, I was with people that would eventually go into all different branches. And it wasn't until I went to the Fort Devens training for basic military intelligence, Army security officer training, that I got in with people that were solely oriented towards the Army Security Agency. And as I recall, most of those people actually came from ROTC programs. I don't recall anybody from West Point. Although I know that when I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, I ran into a guy from West Point in the mess hall, and I asked him what school he was from, or what ROTC program or whatever, and he didn't give me a straight answer. I asked him if he was a direct commission, and he said, no, I didn't come from that, and I said, well, what did you come from? And he said, well, there's another way you can get into the Army, and that's, West Point, and it's something I never thought of, that people actually do graduate from West Point. So there were West Point officers that I did come into contact with. But as I recall, most of the officers that I came into contact with were basically from an ROTC program, although there were 1 or 2 that I came into contact that were direct commissions. In fact, I recall at Fort Benning, Georgia, there was an individual in my platoon that had actually been in Vietnam as a medic and was commissioned directly. And so when you're commissioned directly, then you have to go into a basic officer's training. you could also become an officer by going to officer candidate school. And most of those people had been enlisted men before. And I don't recall encountering very many people that had come from officer candidate school. When I was in Vietnam, it was sort of surprising that, of course, people from my ASA class, ended up in the First Infantry Division as well. Ron Hagel, who was another platoon leader, was someone that I had been to school with and was a friend of mine back at Fort Devens. In fact, we went to Washington, D.C. one weekend, together. So I had known some of these people, and there were other people that I ran into, like Luke Potter, who was actually stationed in Saigon, that I would see periodically. And so the Army Security Agency was a relatively small organization compared to the Army as a whole. So you would keep running into the same people, over the years. And even when I went to Germany, Warrant Officer Bennett, showed up in my field station. And there were other people as well that I had known in Vietnam. So obviously this is a fraternity of people that you keep running into over the years.
You mentioned seeing the enlisted men in their basic training and how rough they had it. Did you have such like that, marching and drilling during the summer camp and that kind of thing?
Absolutely. But again, it wasn't as rough as enlisted men had it. For instance, at Fort Knox, during our pre-summer camp training, you had to go through the parallel bars before you ate. And of course, you got to remember, I'm like 167, 197 pounds, 6'6", the typical weakling, and I don't have a lot of upper body strength. So I could never go through the whole length of the parallel bars, and so I would always end up doing push-ups to make up for the fact that I fell off the bars, and and you have to do push-ups in the mud or the dust or whatever, and or it's freezing cold, and so it's just, you always have somebody shouting at you, or if you sneeze, they make you do 25 push-ups or whatever, or you scratch your nose when you shouldn't have, or you're not wearing a hat. Somebody is always yelling at you, and so it's just constant pressure. And the only time I experienced that was for those couple of days at Fort Knox. Other than that, the officer has the officers club. Normally it's oftentimes, if not a 9-to-5 job, at least you have some time off to yourself and you have control over your life. And so it was much better for me as an officer than I saw as the life of an enlisted man.
Now, my father went to the Naval Academy, and he said especially during the first year, plebe summer and plebe year, there was the yelling at, all that, like you just mentioned, a complete building down of the person before building them up, similar to the way the enlisted men have it. In the ROTC program, then, the way you went through in the training and such, there really wasn't as much of that?
I would say correct, that there was not as much. The idea of an officer under the ROTC program, and particularly in military intelligence, is that we were dealing with an information-based mission. And we were dealing with technical equipment. We were dealing with a technical situation. And also, it's a little bit different, perhaps, and this is my personal opinion here, that the ROTC program was basically oriented towards getting a large number of officers into the field as quickly as possible. The military service academies, from my aspect, and my best friend, who I mentioned before, his father was in the Air Force ROTC, he went to the Air Force Academy. And so the Air Force academies, the service academies, are oriented towards building generals, to building career officers, not a reserve officer who's going to be in for 2 years or 4 years and then leave. So the service academies are going to have a more intensive program and build that career loyalty and build that career professionalism from the word go. whereas the reserve officers are there to do a job to the best of their competency for a shorter period of time.
Now, a lot of times there we talk about unit cohesion, where you'll have people who are together in basic training and sent out together and that kind of thing. Were you working in intelligence and such like that together with one unit during training that you stayed with, or did you not experience that kind of security with the same unit until you were in Vietnam?
Basically, the answer is no, in the sense that I did not train with one unit and then get deployed to Vietnam and then spend time there. I rotated into a unit. And this is one of the primary points about the Vietnam War, which I think they have tried to correct to a certain extent during the current Gulf War, or Iraq War rather, is that the period of duty, the tour of duty in Vietnam was 1 year. And so you would drop in out of nowhere, you would spend your year, and then you would disappear. And so there was a constant turnover of personnel whose time was up. And so there wasn't the unit cohesion that you would expect from a unit that had trained together, been deployed together, and then operated together. So it was basically, as I said, you drop out of nowhere into this situation, you have to learn it, and I changed job about every 6 months when I was in the Army, just because of the normal rotation. You know, there's a job opens up, they've got to fill it, they take their experienced people and then move them from platoon leader to liaison officer, whatever. And so there's this constant turnover of personnel, and you just had to react to that.
Now, what was the purpose then of your training as a platoon leader?
Well, the training involved several things, of course. There was my basic training in ROTC in the sense of general leadership and managerial type aspects of dealing with personnel and their disruptive influences and just the organization of them and how to maintain discipline and deal with details and look out for their welfare, etc. And then there was also the combat platoon leaders training that dealt with familiarization with how a combat platoon or combat unit works, because I had to support them and I had to realize what capabilities they had and what their needs were as far as locating enemy positions and enemy capabilities, and what information is going to be of use to a combat unit from an intelligence standpoint. And of course, in intelligence we have a lot of limitations. And these were evident in Vietnam in the sense that we could very often tell the location of a unit with some discrepancy. But we had very little information about the intention of what that unit was going to do. Were they going to attack, retreat, move here, move there? You don't know what's going to happen. All you can say is, we believe that the 277th Vietnam Regiment is here. That's all we know. And so, the First Infantry Division may react by having a brigade sweep in that area, or I Corps or 2 Corps rather might have an airstrike, or it might have a B-52 strike on that location, or whatever, depending on the intelligence and what other intelligence was going on. So at any rate, going back to your original question, my training as a platoon leader was not only so I could lead my own platoon, which was a brigade support platoon, but also so that I could be familiar with the needs of our customers, so to speak.
A brigade support platoon?
That's correct.
Did you lead such a platoon?
Yes.
What exactly does that involve?
Well, the brigade support companies had platoons that, the division support companies. It was the 337th Radio Research Company. And then that company consisted of 3 or 4 different platoons. Actually, there was a liaison group that supported division headquarters. We called it the LNO group, or the LNO platoon, I guess you might say, or section. And then there was a platoon in support of each of the 3 brigades. And so I was supporting the 2nd Brigade and worked with the Brigade S2. And so my brigade was headquartered at Zion, spelled essentially D-I, capital A-N. With or without the little slash mark through the D, I forget in which way it is. One way it's Z, and the other way it's D in Vietnamese. But at any rate, it was pronounced Zion. There was another brigade at, I think, Phuc Vinh, and my friend Hagel was in the platoon leader there for a while. And then I believe there was another platoon up at Quan Loy, or with the 1st or the 3rd Brigade. So each of the brigades had a brigade support platoon with a 2nd lieutenant in charge. And I supported the 2nd Brigade. Other platoons supported the 2 other brigades in other base camps. And so during that time, when I started out, when I first came in country, I started out at the 3rd Platoon, which was actually at Lai Khe, as I recall. And the LNO was also at Lai Khe, and so the platoon leader went over to run the LNO section while that person was on R&R or something. And so I acted as the platoon leader for a week or 2. And then I went back down to Zion and then worked with the 2nd Brigade for several months. So I spent several months in support of the 2nd Brigade. And during that time, I had my own little compound in the Zion base camp with concertina wire around it, so we had security. Concertina is that barbed wire, the coiled stuff, and we'd have it stacked up in 3 things around our perimeter. And within our compound, we had a tent where the enlisted men would sleep. We had an operations tent or a building. I think they eventually had a tropical wood building, which was on a laterite pad to keep it above the water in the ground, the mud. And then we had some vehicles, 2.5-ton trucks, a 3/4-ton truck with electronic huts in the back. And the company headquarters with their communications was at Zion as well. And I know that I collected a lot of messages from the message center at the company level and transferred those to the S2. Just couried them back and forth. So I had the company support there at Zion with me. And the main thing that I did during that time is that we had short-range radio direction finding units. And we had 3 units. And each unit consisted of 2 men, and they had a Jeep with a trailer. And they had a VHF radio on the Jeep, and it had a KY8, KY8, KY7, I don't remember the designation, but it's crypto equipment. So they would have encrypted voice communications back to the headquarters, which was at the company. And they would have this PRD-1, which they'd call a turd one because they didn't like it. It was on essentially a high-frequency radio receiver on a tripod. And it had a diamond-shaped directional antenna that would go up about 3 feet roughly. And you could rotate this thing, and it had a dial on the top of the receiver, and you would read off the reading of where the strongest signal was. And that was how they would try to determine the direction that this signal was coming from. And we're talking about high frequency, which is 1 to 30 megacycles, and it's Morse code. It's not voice, it's Morse code. And they're sending code groups. And so it would stay up, that is transmit, long enough that you could try to get a fix on it. So I had 3 of these units that I would deploy in various parts of the company, or excuse me, the division area of operations. And they would be all over the place. It depended on where the division was operating. There was a Duster compound nearby. Duster was an artillery group, essentially. There was another airfield at Fuloy, I believe, where I had a lot of people. I had people at Lai Kay. I would try to put people at fire support bases. The Fukong Engineer School was one place I tried to put people. There was a leprosarium somewhere in our area that I tried to put people, but I couldn't pull that off. So at any rate, I would deploy these teams in such a way that they could cover the area of operations that the division was working in at that time. And that would be a several kilometer area. So a large part of my time was spent arranging for these people to stay with various other organizations such as fire support bases. And I would travel around, I would take them their mail, I would try to visit them periodically. So I traveled by helicopter quite a bit and by Jeep somewhat. And usually when I traveled by Jeep, there would be somebody that would be a driver, or sometimes I would drive and there would be another person. So I didn't travel alone. And within our general area, it was secure enough that we could travel by Jeep on the roads. So that's what I spent most of my time doing.
And what is it exactly that they were trying to do? Trying to pick up the signals of who were you trying to communicate with in that way?
Well, the VC had transmitters as part of their military units, and I believe they were probably Chinese manufacturer. As I said, they would transmit in Morse code. A large part of these at this level were at the higher level, like Viet Cong division, as opposed to lower Viet Cong units that may or may not have voice communication. We had some people that were monitoring voice communications. However, most of our effort was directed towards the Morse code for various reasons. They copied it and we would send it off for decryption. And I don't know how successful they were at decrypting it. I just wasn't a party to that. I was at the lower level collection aspects of it. And this was basically done at the company level. But you would try to establish what schedules these people would keep. And then when you know that a transmitter was going to be up at a certain time, then you would either try to have your direction finding people be on the lookout for that particular transmitter, or they would be tipped off by somebody at the company who was monitoring in the normal course of business, monitoring these transmitters, and then we would try to get a direction finding fix on them. And so with voice communications, first of all, voice communications are normally short. They are VHF transmissions, not high frequency transmissions. And so the technology is a little bit different. And just the mechanics of it, because it's so short you can't get a fix on it. You have two people on two different ends engaging in a conversation, so it's constantly switching back and forth between two geographic locations. Whereas with the Morse code communication, they're sending encrypted code groups, and it takes them a couple of minutes to do this. So it gives you time to get a fix on them. And again, this is information that you don't want out there because you don't want people to take steps to foil your efforts. So at any rate, our effort was mainly oriented towards the high frequency communications and doing the direction finding on that from the short range direction finding units. And again, these are high frequency units which high frequency waves travel quite a long distance. The receivers could receive signals from quite a distance, but with direction finding, you want to have a baseline that's long enough that you get an angle so that when you have the three fixes together that they're not, that they're almost, 60 degrees or whatever, as close to that as possible so that you get a good exact fix. What you normally end up is where you have an intersection of the three different fixes and you have an area of probability where those, that transmitter could be. And if you have a shallow angle, let's say you have a baseline of your three direction finding stations that are very close together because you can't deploy them out, then those angles are going to be very shallow. And with a very little change of angle, there's going to be a large difference because you're several kilometers out as to where that transmitter is, so you don't get very good location. So the idea was to deploy these units in a wide enough separation so that we could get good coverage over the area of operations of the division and come up with some useful intelligence. And I can't recall any particular instance when we were really successful at this, although it probably did happen. I do know that we had one fix one time where I ended up going up in a helicopter and checking out that particular area because it was nearby. And I don't remember exactly how this happened, whether I told this to the S2 and he sent me over to the helicopter pad and whatever, but I know a friend of mine who was a helicopter pilot was the guy that said, well, let's go up and look at it. And we were flying an LOH, a light observation helicopter, which is just a two-person, very small helicopter. And so we flew over this area, and there's nothing happened. We didn't see anything, no movement, nothing there. He said, well, let's recon by fire. And so he pulls out a 40-millimeter grenade launcher, and he says, here, loads this. And so I load it, and then he pops a couple of rounds out the window, and nobody fires back. So I guess there wasn't anything there, So we don't know whether it was a false positive or just an inaccurate reading or whatever. So, I don't know what happened.
So in general, do you believe that the Army's attempts at gathering intelligence were successful or not?
Well, I think that we had a lot of success with special intelligence during Vietnam with the airborne radio direction finding system, ARDF, as opposed to the short-range direction finding that I was directly involved in with the PRD-1s. I'm really not quite, I don't recall a lot of success with the PRD-1s. And there may have been some success, I just don't recall it. We did get fixes every once in a while. But the main success was with the airborne radio direction finding system. And we had a link with that through our LNO. The LNO section at division headquarters had a radio link with the airborne platform when they were in our area. So there was a direct transfer between fixes that the airborne platform got and the division headquarters. And I was responsible for that later after I left the 2nd Brigade and was head of the LNO section. And that was at Lai Khe, which was north of Xi'an. Lai Khe was the home of Danger Forward, which was the forward division headquarters, and also the whole division was up there for a period of time. So at any rate, the greatest success, I think, was with the airborne radio direction finding system. And what we're talking about is, I believe, a Seminole aircraft, which is a Cessna Seminole. It's a 3-person aircraft. And I actually flew an ARDF mission as part of my familiarization. And this flew out of Saigon, out of Tan Son Nhut. And again, they were part of the 509th Group, and they were part of that direct organization. So the airplane would fly in, and I don't know how many airplanes there were, but they had radio direction finding dipoles out on the wings. And there was a pilot, a co-pilot, which was my job when I was flying with them, and then there was the interceptor who was sitting behind us. And he would operate the radio. And I believe the pilot could hear the signal when they had a transmitter up. And the pilot would be very aggressive about moving the aircraft through the signal path in order to determine what the strongest signal direction was. And at that point, my job as a co-pilot was to essentially plot our position and plot the azimuth for that signal. And we had Doppler radar, which was essentially navigational radar, which would tell us our position. And we had to zero that before we took off. And so I had a map or a chart sheet on my lap where I could chart out the direction of the fix, if we had anything. I recall at least one attempt, but I don't think we were able to get a fix on it because the signal didn't stay up long enough to get a good fix. So at any rate, the ARDF program was, I believe, very successful. And it was part of my job to, even at the 2nd Brigade, to transmit ARDF information to the S2 intelligence officers. And what they did is they had, or the Army Security Agency would assign code names to the various transmitters. And for instance, the 9th VC Division might be given a certain name like Finnish, or George might be the 272nd VC Regiment. And so instead of saying the 9th VC Division is here, we would say, Finnish is here or George is here. And we would, try to use that as a means of sanitizing and provide a buffer between the source of the information and its actual use. But these people knew, that is, the intelligence officers knew this was a division, a VC division level or whatever, designation. And every morning I would have pins in a map and show where the locations were, the latest locations of these particular units. And the funny thing was that we used the term Fred for an unidentified unit. And so one time an officer said, this guy Fred, he moves around quite a bit. And I said, no, it's a different guy every time, And so we use names to refer to these different organizations that we were targeting just as a security measure.
So again, you were trying to find out where the units were based on where the transmitter signals were.
That is correct.
Also, when I asked about the success or not of Army intelligence, how do you define whether it's successful or not?
Well, again, that's more of a question for our customers than for us. But basically, the way to evaluate its success is, and I'm basically talking about evaluating its accuracy, is to see if there are other sources of intelligence that collaborate this information. And so that's the job of the division level or the brigade level intelligence officer, et cetera, is to take all these sources of information and collaborate them and see if there are, interrogations from prisoner of war, people that they've captured that say, what unit are you from? And, where were you? And they say, well, we were by the big river up north, just past the rubber plantation. And then, we've got a fix on some unit up there, then that's collaborative information. Or if there's a, contact between a large force and they get a lot of fire, and we've got a fix on a large group in that area, then, there's collaboration. So, you can judge your information by whether it's collaborated by more than one source. And within military intelligence, there was a grading of information to evaluate it from A1 to F6. F6 was the worst. And so, you would say an F6 source was just totally unreliable. And then the A1 source was your best source of intelligence.
So you would take this information and give it to the S2, who was a member of the brigade, but was the one in charge of intelligence for the brigade?
That is correct.
Okay. Also, why did they use Morse code?
Well, Because it's simple, and a Morse code transmitter is very simple. The technology is simple. And also, Morse code can punch through a lot of atmospheric problems, and you may not, and you have a greater distance. Voice is very limited in geographic range, and also it can be very difficult to understand the sender if there are technical problems, if there are propagation problems, or you don't have a good antenna, or you've got something between you, you're on the backside of a hill, whereas the high frequency communications with Morse code could overcome a lot of these difficulties. And as I said, it was just the way the VC were organized. It was very simple technology. It was very effective communications. You could communicate for long distances, and so you just use Morse code for all those purposes. And the U.S. forces would use it for the same reasons, although our technology was a lot better. So we obviously use mostly voice communications.
Did they know that we were listening in on their transmissions?
You'll have to ask them that. I don't know. It was certainly our purpose to avoid telling them that we were listening in on them. And in fact, part of my job was as a communications security officer. And it was my job to train and advise individuals within our supported divisions as to the necessity for communications and security, so that in case they had the capability to listen to us, and there's no reason to believe that they didn't, that they would not be able to get the information from listening to us that we're getting from listening to them, et cetera. So communication security was part of my job as well as communications intelligence. In fact, we had little stickers, and I've got some of them with me, little orange stickers that say, the enemy is listening. We used to hand these out, and then there's another one that said, Charlie is listening. And it was designed to be small so that you could put it on the handset of a field phone. Field phones or telephones are the most secure means of communication. So we would always encourage people to use field phones whenever they could, rather than use radio communications, which could be monitored by Charlie, by the VC.
Do you want to go ahead and change the tape? I think we're at a good pausing point.
Is that okay?
Mm-hmm. Oh, this is being excellent. I'm learning a lot and taking lots of notes.
Okay. Well, I'm trying to be as accurate as I can.
Yeah, yeah.
I get the impression that it's basically unclassified at this stage 40 years later.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would imagine after that amount of time.
Did you need a drink, water, or anything?
Yeah, that would help.
Yeah.
Is there a
Tape's rolling.
Now, what were your first impressions when you first arrived in Vietnam? Just going
Well,
back a
that's a
little.
very good question. And my first impression was that when America goes to war, they take their entire way of life with them. And when I landed at Bien Hoa, and I traveled to Long Binh, which wasn't all that far, you see acres and acres of hard stands and buildings and tents and trucks and supplies and shipping containers and just everything. And even in the base camp, you know, we had a PX, we had an officer club, an NCO club. One night I remember we even had pizza that we ordered from the NCO club. And on Sundays we would have cookouts and have hamburgers and lobster tails and whatever. But at any rate, you know, and we had Pacific Architects and Engineers as the base people to maintain the base. And so, you know, I just didn't expect the size of it. I just found it was just overwhelming what was all involved. And just everything, you know, everything from helicopter maintenance to truck maintenance, just everything was there. And so, as I said, you know, we had donut dollies, we had the Red Cross girls in base camp, there was bars essentially on the Army post and the Officers Club and NCO clubs. So, you know, you just had everything. You weren't out in a tent in the middle of nowhere shooting your gun. You know, you had places to spend money, etc. So, as I said, when Americans go to war, they just take their entire way of life with them. That was my initial reaction.
And what were your initial impressions of the Vietnamese people?
Well, I had not been really in a third world country before too much. I had been to Panama in between the time I was at Fort Benning and the time I went to Fort Devens. My friend in the Air Force Academy and I went down to Panama and eventually to Puerto Rico on just a week vacation. So I really hadn't had a lot of experience with a third world country. And obviously traveling around, I would see the Vietnamese people and the shacks that they lived in, and you know, their way of life, which is basically agricultural. So my only impression of them was that they were small. You know, here I am 6'6", and most of them are like 4 feet. And so, you know, this was their country, and that's just the way it was. I didn't really have a lot of impression of them because I was focused on doing my job. I really wasn't too concerned with them, you know.
So during your time there, did you have any sort of contact with them or involvement with the people themselves?
Very little. You know, my involvement was traveling around, and you know, kids would come up to you on the street and they'd want C rations or whatever. You know, one time I was coming back from Saigon, and my Jeep had a flat tire. When we got out to fix it, I put my camera down on the seat, and some kid stole it, you know, walked off with it. The other children indicated to me that he had stuffed it up under his shirt and ran off. which was not a big loss because the camera wasn't very good anyway. But you know, you would see kids on the street, you would see people on the street when you're traveling around. And there was some contact with the Vietnamese who were working on post. For instance, we had Vietnamese girls in the mess hall, you know, doing cleanup, bussing the tables, serving drinks, you know, iced tea, Kool-Aid, whatever we were having that day, and being mess hall girls, barmaids, you know, in the officers' club, etc. And so we had some contact with those. I might mention, however, that when I was at Fort Benning, Georgia, we had 3 ARVN officers, Vietnamese officers, that went through the same training that we were going through as combat platoon leaders. And so we got to talk to them a little bit. And that was just to give us some familiarity with working with Vietnamese officers. So the 3 of those, you know, we had contact with as part of our training in Vietnam, excuse me, at Fort Benning before we went to Vietnam. In Vietnam itself, I had just casual contact with the Vietnamese people.
What was your impression of the effectiveness of the ARVN?
I really wasn't in a position to judge that. All I heard was, you know, how ineffective they were, and you know, I just wasn't in a position because I didn't have very much contact with them. They, you know, I didn't even see them. You know, you would see them out in public sometimes. If you're traveling around, you'd see ARVN officers, and the American advisors were the only people in Vietnam that wore camouflage fatigues at that time. You know, our normal fatigues are just plain OD green. So you would know when you saw an American Army officer who was obviously American, not ARVN, wearing jungle fatigues or combat fatigue or camouflage fatigues, that he was an ARVN advisor. But you know, I just simply didn't have contact with them, and I'm just not really in a position to judge their effectiveness. I'm sure some were more effective than others. You know, I simply don't know.
How did you and other officers and soldiers with you view the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese?
Well, you know, obviously they're a very abstract enemy, and they are the enemy. And you get lulled into a false sense of security over a period of time because nothing really happens. You know, where I was at, we didn't get mortared or rocketed very often, although occasionally it would happen. Never during my entire year and a half in Vietnam did I ever come under small arms fire. Just never. Nobody ever shot at me, essentially. The only time, you know, I came under fire was during mortar attacks, which is just general, you know, they try to pop in a few rounds, and the base camp was pretty much of a large target, so, you know, you could hit it. You wouldn't know what you were shooting at, but rounds would land normally down the airfield because that was the largest part of the base camp. But at any rate, eventually I went on R&R and went down to Saigon. This was after the Tet Offensive. And we had a rocket attack in the middle of the night, and I fell out of bed. And it occurred to me then that, you know, somebody really is out there trying to kill me. You know, these guys are serious. And, you know, it was at that point, and I'd been, you know, almost a year in Vietnam, and, you know, it really dawned on me that, you know, these guys are really trying to kill me. And so, you know, I really didn't have any thoughts before then, except that, you know, these guys are trying to kill me, I'm trying to kill them, or make sure they get killed, and, you know, that's just the way it is. So, at any rate, you know, my thoughts on the Viet Cong, the Vietnamese, you know, the enemy of Vietnamese, were that basically it was just an abstract thing to me in the sense that, you know, they were pins on the map, information that in my messages, And it probably wasn't until I came under fire directly that I realized that, you put 1 and 2 together and find out, it's those guys out there that are trying to kill me in here. And so there's a little bit of a disconnect there.
What exactly did you understand was the purpose of U.S. involvement in Vietnam?
Well, obviously we were assisting the Vietnamese government. More specifically, during the time I was with the First Infantry Division, we engaged in what was known as Lam Son 67, which was basically a pacification operation for Gia Dinh province, which is the area north of Saigon. Gia Dinh province is around the city of Saigon, and then north of that is Binh Duen province. And I meant to say Binh Duen is the area for Lam Son 67. And Binh Duen province was largely a agricultural area. It's not a lot of jungle. It's a lot of open space, cattle farms, dairy farms. I saw people selling pineapple, fruit and vegetables, truck farm type of stuff that would have to get to market down in the more populous area near Saigon. And so the First Infantry Division was trying to pacify that area. By that I mean keep the Viet Cong out, so that people would have the roads open and that commerce could take place for economic development between the producers in Binh Duen province and the customers down closer to Saigon. And there was a very good road, Road 1A, from the Binh Duen province area down to Saigon. And then Route 13 went on up to Lai Khe through the, I think the western edge of that. And Route 13, known as Thunder Road, was a laterite highway. It was an unimproved highway at that stage. And a large effort was devoted to keeping Route 13 open. And the VC would blow the culverts every once in a while to disrupt the road. The 1st Infantry Engineer Battalion, would try to keep the road open, ready to repair it. Every morning they'd do a sweep. And if there was anything wrong with the road, they would repair it. Sometimes they had AVLBs, which were armored vehicle launched bridges, which were essentially a big scissor-like thing on an armored vehicle, and you could deploy this to bridge a small bridge or a culvert that had been blown so that traffic could flow until they could get it repaired. So the 1st Engineer Brigade, Division, Battalion, whatever it was, did a very good job on road clearing and maintaining the roads in an open condition to allow this commerce to take place. And also there's just general pacification in the sense of keeping the VC out of the area to allow people simply to live. And so the mission there was basically to Vietnamization. We were also at that stage training ARVN officers, and so the division was engaged in some training activities, and they were engaged in some psychological operations. They were engaged in village fairs where they would have med caps. The medical officers would go out and set up a dispensary for a day and treat people that came in. And so they would treat the medical ailments of the people and try to engage in just their general welfare and improving that. So the mission of the 1st Division at that stage was to try to pacify the Binh Duen province area and to keep the Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, out of there, just simply to allow the South Vietnamese to live a normal life.
So was what you were doing in Xi'an part of this?
Correct, yes.
Did this involve the Chu Hoi program?
The Chu Hoi program was a generalized program, and I'm not familiar with that. That's a psychological operation where it was encouraging people in the North Vietnamese army to defect, and offering them money for their guns or whatever, or whatever it was. It was not something I was involved in. It was a general program throughout the entire country. and I have very little information on that. I just, collected all these leaflets that were laying around just because they were colorful, and they were pretty, so I picked them up. And you'd come across them laying on the ground or whatever, and so I collected a number of them, which I have still.
Did you see part of the U.S.'s intentions in Vietnam as being pushing back communism, that kind of thing?
Well, just remember, I'm at the tactical level, and we're just trying to keep the VC out of our area. The bigger picture, of course, is to fight communism, because the North Vietnamese are communists, and they have, tried to influence the local VC units to attack the Americans and attack the representatives of the Vietnamese government. So the bigger picture was, of course, to fight communism, but the basic, general thing, the small view that we had was simply to keep the VC out and to keep the level of violence down so that these people could engage in economic development, and they could build schools, and they could, establish a provincial government and just engage in the normal administration of their region.
Do you believe that was successful?
To a certain extent it was. But of course, all that came to an end many years later when the Vietnamese army failed to hold back the North Vietnamese, and then of course the whole